Okay, looks like our numbers took a bit of a jump there, so I'll go ahead and start. So as Scott mentioned, I am Betsy Leatherman. I'm the Global President of the Leadership Circle, and I am very excited to have you here with us today. I am joining you from my home office in Minneapolis, where it has just started snowing after a 70-degree day. So we're experiencing quite a shift here. We've got people joining us from all over the globe today, which is really exciting. And we'll be happy to spend the next 30 minutes with you. Today we'll be covering the universal model, your results from your self-assessment, and then some potential next steps. First, we want to talk just a little bit about the universal model and why we recommend using a model for leadership at all. For those of you that have come to us through the book Mastering Leadership or our second book, Scaling Leadership, you've heard this quote before, and it is that models really help explain how things work. And we know the truth is that when a good model gets inside of you, it can inform and guide you for a whole lifetime. I've been here for the last 5 years, and I can tell you that's been my experience with the Leadership Circle profile model, and I'm really excited to help you walk through and understand your results today. A few things about the model just to be aware of. The model points to stages of development. So most people have really begun to understand, but 20 or so years ago, we thought adults kind of got to adulthood and there you were. The reality is we all know you're constantly learning, changing, and shifting. The environment around us continues to increase in complexity and ambiguity, and so we too must change to meet that. The change that happens is a stage development shift, and the universal model and the Leadership Circle profile point to directionally where someone is kind of along that continuum. It also measures key leadership competencies. So it can easily be used as a way to look at how you're doing with respect to either people, task, relating, caring, and I'll walk through the details of that in just a bit. It tends to assess beliefs and your assumptions as well. So it gives you an opportunity to look just a little bit deeper at those core beliefs that are driving your behavior. And indeed, it integrates quite a few models. If you, like me, are someone that has a particularly strong connection to a model, for example, I love Myers-Briggs, you can see it inlaid throughout the universal model. You can see many models. And actually, Chapter 1 in Mastering Leadership outlines all of the various leadership models that underlie the Leadership Circle profile. So that's a bit about the model. Now I want to tell you a little bit about how to understand and read it, because that's how your results come to you. So when you look at the model, it's a circle, no surprise there. But really to us, that circle represents the holistic nature of leadership development and the leadership journey. If you think of it as the globe, where the equator line would be that line in the middle, anything north of that are what we call the creative competencies. Those are things that leaders do that are inspiring, engaging, and unleashing of nature in a system or an environment. They're also highly correlated with leadership effectiveness and business performance. So that upper half is considered the creative competencies. On the lower half, those are considered the reactive styles or reactive tendencies. These are also leadership behaviors that get things done. However, they tend to do that with more effort or energy loss for either the leader or the system that's around the leader. So the top are the creative competencies and the bottom are the reactive tendencies. The left-hand side of the model is all about people orientation, and the right-hand side is all about task. So if you were to think of a leader that you know, and if you think of someone that, oh, they're such a people person, they may tend to score higher on the left-hand side of the profile. Whereas there are other leaders who really focus on and make sure tasks get done. They may tend to be more on the task side. Of course, the The well-balanced leader is that leader which can have both represented. But we do look at those as two competencies inside of both creative and reactive. So creative, reactive, people, and task. I want to tell you a little bit more about the creative competencies specifically. So one of the things you'll notice is that there's an inner circle and outer dimensions. And all of those inner and outer creative dimensions are highlighted here in blue. Let's start first with the relating. If I were to look at your score in relating and say, oh, you have a 50% in that relating category, 50 percentile, you might say, well, what is that made up of? Relating is made up of caring connection, fosters team play, collaborator, mentoring and developing, and interpersonal intelligence. Those are the outer dimension competencies that support that inner dimension of relating. Our next creative competency is self-awareness, the ability to watch oneself in action and be aware of what's happening, what's going on. The 4 outer dimension categories here are selfless leader, balance, composure, and personal learner. The next category is authenticity, with integrity and courageous authenticity being the 2 outer dimension competencies that create that inner dimension of authenticity. The next is systems awareness. Community concern, sustainable productivity, and systems thinker all make up the systems awareness category. These are leaders that are able to think about all of the different aspects of a system at play versus just a particular problem that they're trying to solve. They look much more holistically, much more systemically. And then achieving, strategic focus, purposeful and visionary, achieve results, and decisiveness. Those 5 inner dimensions and the outer dimensions make up the creative competencies. And just as a reminder, these are most highly correlated with both leadership effectiveness and business performance. So when you get your results of your self-assessment, you'll be able to look at your own scores on these dimensions, both in a raw form as well as how you match up against the database. And I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. Before we get to that, I want to tell you a little bit about the reactive styles or reactive tendencies. Now, these are the leadership competencies that negatively correlate with leadership effectiveness and business results or business performance. Complying is the first category. That's made up of being conservative, pleasing, belonging, and passive. You can kind of hear the people orientation nature of that particular slice of the pie, right? You can imagine how that's a reactive people response. Next is protecting, and the 3 outer dimension categories are distance, critical, and arrogance. I'll mention to you there are kind of 2 types of arrogance that we see. There's the traditional arrogance that we might be familiar with when we think of the word. And there's another kind of arrogance that sometimes shows up, and it's a bit sneakier of an arrogance. So I like to call it the sneaky arrogance. And it's the one where the leader doesn't necessarily realize that what they're telling their team or their directs is that they know how to do it better. It shows up in the form of help often. Don't worry about that, I'll handle it. Oh, you don't even bother yourself with that, I'll step in. That can come off as arrogant because underneath that, a leader is really saying, I'll handle that because I don't think you can necessarily. That's the sneakier arrogance that shows up. And then there's controlling, autocratic, ambition, driven, and perfect. So those are the elements that make up the reactive tendencies. You'll also get to see your results as it relates to the reactive tendencies, reactive styles. You'll see your raw score and a percentile score, just like your creative competencies. So after you've gone in, and whether you've joined the self-assessment because of mastering leadership or because of scaling leadership, or maybe your organization is using the self-assessment for an intact team session. Perhaps your leader has gone through the full LCP and they wanted you to have an experience with it or get a taste of it. Whatever way you join us, we don't mind. We just want you here doing leadership development growth and working on your leadership development journey. Once you complete the questionnaire, you'll be directed to a page that looks just like this. On this page, you can download your graph report, you can actually get your numeric report, or you could retake the survey. As a matter of fact, in preparation for today, I retook the survey again, the self-survey, which now I can't even tell you how many times I've taken it. While results don't tend to shift dramatically in a short period of time, over about 12 to 18 months, if you've really been working on something, you should begin to see those results shift. We have a process actually that's called the PULSE process that can help a bit with that too. It can help you focus on one big developmental change that you need to make. Sometimes when we get assessment data back, we think we need to boil the ocean, particularly if we're high in that controlling or driven category. We might make long lists of all the things we want to do different. Research shows that really it's one thing that you want to do different and focus on that will help you make the biggest impact. So when you get your report or you've done your questionnaire, you can go back in and get your report and go through your results. Here's what each of them look like. On the far left-hand side, you have what the data report looks like. It's got a bit of swoosh of our logo and it's in blue. In this report, you'll see your raw scores, how you scored in each category that I went through before on a scale of 1 to 5. And you'll also see how that compares to our database. Now, our database, and I mentioned it before, about 125,000 leaders and just over 2.5 million raters. So when you get that raw score, you'll be able to see how you compare up against that group. Of course, if you're at the 50th percentile, you know that half of that group scores higher than you and half of that group scores lower than you. If you're at the 80th percentile, you can adjust from there and begin to look. It's really interesting. What I will tell you is that the bar for leadership is high. So you can, in some categories, get a 3 or even a 4 and still have a pretty low percentile. The expectation of leaders sometimes are explicit, sometimes are implicit, but we know this. The standards that leaders are held to are very, very high. This is why we think it's really important for people to be on a leadership development journey. Your environment is constantly changing and getting more complex. And so your ability to deal with that complexity from a place of complexity of mind has to change and adapt with that so that you can thrive and flourish inside of that environment. Your report will give you all the quantitative details on that. Now, if you were to choose to take the full Leadership Circle profile and open it up for others to give you feedback as well, that quantitative report would also have a qualitative page. Your raters would be able to answer questions about your leadership. What are your greatest leadership assets, skills, and talents, and what suggestions they might have for leveraging those? What are some of their great leadership challenges, and what would they suggest you consider for those as well? So that report, when you migrate to a full 360, actually becomes just a beautiful diary of not only the quantitative, but also some great qualitative data. I've had several people say, gosh, if I could just have the qualitative feedback from my own colleagues, it would make a significant impact as well. Then you'll get your graph. I've put a sample graph here for you to see. This is just one of our test cases. You'll note that the scores are kind of all over the circle. Now, kind of a fun story. When we originally created the self-assessment about 2 years ago, just the self-assessment, I wasn't sure if people were going to be, completely honest as they filled out their questionnaires. And the reality is, everybody has been so honest and so truthful about where they stand right now as a leader. I've been incredibly impressed with the amount of self-awareness and people's ability to give themselves real direct feedback so that they can use that as a tool to grow. Additionally, you receive the interpretation guide shown here on the right in blue. This interpretation guide goes through each of the categories in more detail, walks you through little bit bigger definition, and even gives you some next steps on what you might want to do to help look at growth or change and what areas you may want to focus on. Finally, we have a YouTube page, and I've put the link here. On that YouTube page, we have various resources of walking through the different outer dimension competencies. I think there's a video of me walking through the actual graph. I find every time I explain it, every time I go through it, I learn just a little bit more about it. So I recommend that you go to that, listen to it, watch it, use it as a model. I want to share a story from this morning. I received an email from a gentleman in Ecuador who had just done his self-assessment maybe a month ago. And he was so inspired by the universal model and his opportunity for growth. He wanted to call and just talk about how he could possibly bring more of this to his team. He said that when he read the interpretation guide and looked at his own results, he could really see that he had been having a bit more of reactive tendencies and he wanted to shift. I was so inspired by what he shared, and he talked a little bit about the one big thing he was working on. He had gone to personal learner. So in the self-awareness category, he had gone to personal learner, and what he wanted to do was really focus on, how do I learn more about the model? How do I learn more about being a more effective leader? And how do I bring that to my team? It was really, really exciting. It looks like we have a question that has popped up. Scott, do you want to take that one?
Betsy, it was a message from me. I copied the YouTube link and put it in the chat. So
perfect. Thanks, Scott.
You're welcome.
So that's a little bit about reviewing your results. Here's what I'll tell you. If you have any problems or any questions or anything at all, please feel free to email us. Scott, perhaps you can put up the TLC, a little TLC email. Email us and let us know you have questions. We would love to walk through your results with you and help you understand them and begin to think through what you might want to focus on, shift, or change. And even in some cases, just having someone to sit with you and go through the results from an awareness place is just, it's really helpful. I'm going to move to this one last piece that I just want to make you aware of, because I think it's helpful in terms of understanding the various elements of the report. The Leadership Effectiveness Scale, there are 5 questions asked in the survey. There are the 5 questions which most highly correlate to business performance we did a test study basically. So they most highly correlate to business performance and the creative competencies. These 5 questions, the scale for these are found at the very bottom of your report. So you'll notice on the left-hand side, there's a creative to reactive scale. You also have a relationship to task scale on the top, and leadership potential utilization on the right. On the bottom, you'll see leadership effectiveness. So these 5 questions, compared to the database, you have both raw score and percentile score. Here's what I wanted to share with you that I think is so interesting. This graph shows the correlation between the leadership effectiveness scale and the creative competencies. So for those mathematicians out there, the correlation value is 0.93, so almost perfectly correlated, which hardly exists in nature. So that's the leadership effectiveness scale to the creative competencies. At the end of the day, it kind of boils down to those 5 questions, right? Knowing where you sit in any particular minute, knowing where those are really is impactful to know how you're doing on the creative competencies. Now, here are the reactive tendencies and the correlation there. So you'll also notice that's a negative 0.68. So the leadership effectiveness scale has high correlation to creative competencies and high negative correlation to the reactive tendencies, and also has quite a bit of correlation with business performance. This is written up in one of our papers, and we're happy to share that with you. I believe it is on the leadership circle website as well. So some more fun information, and of course, all of this is in your interpretation manual and assessment guide and available for you to look at. So as I'm wrapping up here, I want to open up to any questions at all. Please feel free to type it into the group chat if you have any thoughts or questions at all. Read through your results. If you have any questions, please let us know what those might be, whether you email us or give us a call. We are happy to help you watch through them. I'll also share with you what we tell people as soon as they get done reviewing their results, to raise your awareness level and notice what you notice. Try and do that before you make a long list of things you might want to change. I'll share a funny story. When I did my last leadership circle profile, my boss and mentor, Bill Adams, said to me, do me a favor. Don't put down all the things that you want to change, because you tell clients not to do that. And so I took it to heart, and I really didn't do it. I didn't write down any of the list that was naturally popping into my very driven head. And I just took 2 weeks to see what I noticed. And in that time, I saw so many very interesting applications of both my reactive tendencies and my creative competencies. The reality is that our growth through the reactive tendencies and up through the creative competencies, it's kind of like a ceiling. The higher your ceiling goes in terms of your awareness of where you could be as a leader, then you get to play in that whole space. Will you sometimes still have a reactive tendency? Absolutely, because you're human. But as we move through that and go to more of the creative competencies, we can see ourselves in that place. And then, of course, you're all invited. We'd love to have you complete the full 360. It looks like we have a question here. Let me just ask that. So the question to the group is, given that the self-assessment is not checked against the data from 360 peers or reports, what do you recommend is a great place to start for those who are only beginning with a self-assessment? Great question, Julie. Here's what I would recommend and suggest. First, you get your own kind of take of your leadership. I would recommend going to others if you're interested in their feedback, whether it's peers or directs or your supervisor or even just others around, sharing your results if you're comfortable with that, or just sharing the things you've learned in general and asking for their feedback. Not necessarily having them do the quantitative, unless that's of interest to you, but asking them and saying, how do you think you would describe me in terms of these kind of categories? Does this make sense to you? Do you think I'm seeing this properly, or do you think I'm seeing this correctly? What have you noticed in me? How do I show up to you? Those types of questions can be absolutely fabulous for bringing about the type of data and input that you get by doing the full 360. The other thing that I think can be really interesting is just sending them a note about what you've learned about yourself through the self-assessment and saying, what are other things that you think I might want to be aware of, or what are other things that you think might be very interesting for me to explore in my leadership development? Does that help, Julie? You can let us know by typing in. I will tell you, oh, awesome, thanks, great. Yes. So what about helping a leader who has gone through that and wants to do the debrief? Yeah, so you'd follow the same process. So Julie is one of our certified practitioners. Throughout the globe, we have about 4,000 certified leadership circle practitioners. They get to use all of our tools as well as the self-assessment. So Julie, as you're using that, what I would recommend is you follow steps real similar to like you would with the full LCP. Follow the same process overall, and see what comes out for them, and then finish with that awareness exercise and also begin to open the door with them either going to ask for qualitative feedback from their peers, or perhaps going to the full 360. It's a very nice entree into awareness, the conversation overall, and one's desire to kind of grow more and seek more advancement. I'll share with you guys in our last few moments here. This morning, as I mentioned, I retook the self-assessment. And when I did it, I worked really hard to stay in the moment with the question. As you can imagine, over the last 5 years, I've dealt with these questions a lot. And so I thought, no, just stay with these questions in this moment right now. And I was personally really struck again by the nature of guidance that the model gives, that the survey gives, just by the questions that it asks and the things that it has you think of when you're looking at those questions. How often do I do this? How often do I do that? Do I really have this? At my core, is it really that? It was actually quite a developmental experience for me this morning, doing that again. And so I would invite all of you who have done the self-assessment after some time with your results and work that you're doing to come back in and do it again. Use that as a guiding tool and let it help you continue to propel on your leadership development journey. With that, Scott, if we've got some time for questions, if you want to open it up. We've got, a bit here. We've got just a few moments, and we're also doing more webinars throughout the next months. We'll be doing these self-assessment webinars every 2 weeks, and we hope people just keep joining us, because we know that the more we connect and the more we get together, the more we learn from one another.
Betsy, I'd also like to add on to your answer to Julie's question with the self-assessment. There is another tool that now comes with the self-assessment since the launch of Scaling Leadership, and that is a leadership development plan, which is very helpful when using the self-assessment to start down a path. It definitely makes more sense if you've already read the book, but it can be helpful in its own sense.
Wonderful. And Scott, do you find that in with the interpretation manual?
No. So there should be a link in the results email for you to download the leadership development plan.
Perfect. Wonderful. Just as a bit of a reminder, we do want to connect with you on social media as well. So we have a LinkedIn community, we have a Facebook page, and we're on Twitter as well. So please connect to us, share stories, share articles and papers you're writing, things that we can retweet and repost on your behalf. And we would like to invite you to join the conversation on our leadership journal, The Latest in Conscious Leadership. It's a monthly blog guaranteed, aimed at sharing case studies and stories with all of you. So please feel free to join us. And if you'd like to contribute, you can contact Sarah at the email below. I think that's it for today. Thank you, everyone. And we hope to hear from you very soon. Thanks for joining. Bye-bye.